So we've got to take this rough lumber, which has some curvature to it, a bow, or it's cupped, or it's bowed over the length. You know, it's not perfect. As it dries, it changes shape. So you've got to flatten it and prepare it for the various parts and pieces of your project. So to do that, I usually will chunk it up. That's the technical term. I will cut it a little oversized. So usually 1 inch to 1.5 inches. If you're feeling a little shaky, go with 2. But I used to, when I started out, I used to cut this way too close. I don't know what I was thinking, but I was like really stingy or something with the wood. I thought it was like so precious that I would always just like go a little, like 1/4 or 1/2 inch over. And invariably that came back and bit me later on because I had to cut off and I end up too short. So give yourself a generous amount and chunk it up. Now, if you're working on panel material, this is how you would obviously do it. You're just using the full width or whatever narrower width you're going to get out of a wider board. But if you're getting leg stock out, like legs tend to be, you know, anywhere from, like we have some very light legs in the shaker hall table class that are like 1 3/8 inches square. But then a lot of chair legs are 1 5/8 inches, 1 3/4, and then dining table legs could be anywhere from there on up. But in order to rough out the leg stock, you're usually dealing with thicker material like this. This is some 8/4 material. So it's a good heavy 2 inches thick. But rather than plane this flat and then rip it into the squares for the legs, it's better to rip it rough into the squares the long way. Like let's say we had a leg here and we were going to try to get 3 out and get rid of that sap. We would rip it the long way first, and I would do that on the bandsaw because the bandsaw is a much safer way to saw wood that's not flat yet, because it's going to be maybe a little rocky on the table. And a bandsaw is fine for that because the blade is coming down. It's a thin cut. Where the table saw, it would be dangerous to do that. So don't ever like rip material that's still rough and not flat on the table saw. So anyway, you would chunk these apart like that. And the reason you do that before you square up the legs to this kind of thing, once you've squared up and chunked up your stock, what happens is the internal stresses that existed in the tree have stabilized at this heavier dimension. But once you rip it apart, sometimes you actually see the piece bending and curving outward as it's coming apart. And that's because you're changing the orientation of this kind of like the stabilization of that piece of wood. It's stabilized the way it was sawn initially. And sometimes as you cut and relieve stress, they will bend and curve. So it's a good idea, if you're getting leg stock and you want them to be straight when you finish, to first chunk them out. Then they kind of reestablish equilibrium as a heavy square. Then you can tune them up and square them up. But I want to show you a little taste of the old method. What did they do before they didn't have machines? So I'm going to just grab, this is a piece of pine, white pine, that was from a larger piece, and it looks like is it 5/4? Yeah, it's a heavy 5/4. So nice stock. But pine is a wonderful material. If you want to ever start hand planing, it's a great way to start. So I'm going to just show you a little bit on this pine board. Now, before I start planing, I'm looking at the edge. So if we just look at this edge for a second, and I want to think of the grain direction, you can see that line of the heart. Pine has this little darker heart here, and it's coming down like that. So that's telling me, in all likelihood, I'm also seeing these little flecks here are also tracking downward. So the fibers on this tree, I can actually see them right on the surface here. The fibers are rising out at an angle here. This is great because they're rough, and they're actually, you can see them laying almost like fur on a dog. You know, the fur comes up and it just lays in one direction. So if you pet the dog in one direction, it's nice and smooth. Everything's laying down great. But if you come the other way, you can feel it bristling and coming upward. Well, as I'm running my hand this way, I'm getting thousands of slivers. Or splinters, sorry. What's the correct word for that? Splinters. Okay, we always call them slivers. Did you get a sliver? Anyway, I would run my hand this way, and I'm clearly going against the grain. So if I hand plane in this direction, I'm going to lift that and likely get tear out where the fibers dive down and leave a little hole. So you always want to orient the material to go friendly or with the grain. So I'm going to turn this around, and I'm going to set it into the vise here at the end of the bench on a tail, the end vise here. This is a good way just to clamp material flat on a bench for planing. So what I want to do is, if I was starting and I had this rough board, this is the old method. Master craftsmen back in the day used to have apprentices, and it sounds like a romantic term, but old day apprentices did a lot of the bull work of just thicknessing and surfacing, preparing the rough stock. So it started out, there was just a lot of planing. Imagine you get a rough board like this, it's twisted or it's cupped, and you've got to dimension this down to like 1 inch. So what they would do is they would still chunk it up into the lengths to use. So the benches, that's why your benches aren't like 12 feet long, because you don't ever really work on long pieces like that. We always chunk it up into the rough lengths, and then we go for it. So what they would start out with is a plane called a scrub plane, which this is not. So why am I showing you it? Well, a scrub plane is it's a little narrower than the typical planes, which tend to be about 2.5 inches wide, like this one. It's about 1 inch to 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches wide. And it's got a very specially ground blade on it. It's got what they call a camber on it, which is just a strong arc. And you can, because it's narrow and it's got a camber, you can expose the blade heavier than you normally can with a typical plane. And it takes off a lot of material rapidly without a tremendous amount of force. So what I did here was I grabbed a plane, this is years ago, just an old Miller Falls plane, and I ground the blade, which you can't see, to an arc to work as a scrub plane. Now, not because I ever really dress my material by hand, but usually just if I want to leave the appearance on old pieces of a scrub plane. Because in the period furniture, a lot of times they would leave the backs and the drawer bottoms, the underside of the drawer bottoms, right off the scrub plane. They wouldn't flatten them any further. So you have these beautiful scalloped textures on them. And you can actually see the last touch of the swipe of a hand plane from those days. So it's pretty cool to have one if you're going to use it. But if you were going to prepare this material, you'd go down. I'm going to expose the blade a little bit more. I don't know how far do I get this out here. I did tune this up, but Okay, I'm gonna get some more out. Now, if your board was like, see, I've got a little bit of a crown here, but you can also go diagonally. You hear the scrubbing sound? It's not as elegant as that other sound. I feel like I'm going against the grain right there. I am. This slightly switches. This has like a little bow to it. So you got, in that case, you have to pick your direction or else come in one direction and then come back the other way. I think I'm going to stick with this direction. Okay, now I'm getting down to it where I'm starting to see fuller shavings. So these are pretty thick, and they're arced in the middle. You can see that one. And the surface has that really sweet, like scallop texture. And it's good to get in shape, which I think I need more of. But it is one of the most physical things you do in the shop is when you're hand planing. But thank God we don't really have to do this method. So we go. I would have to keep dressing that down flat. And then if I got it flat and I wanted a 1-inch thick board, I then would index off the edge and make a line all around. And then I'd have to plane from the other side till we had a well-dimensioned piece. Then you'd go to a longer bodied plane and a longer bodied plane, so you could work your way up through the planes, which I'm not going to do, until you get up to a plane like this. And this is a joiner plane because the longer the sole of the plane, the larger area you can flatten really accurately. Let me show you the more machine method. So these days, we're going to use a power method. But it's good to use the hand tools because you get more of the direct response from the wood. You know more what's happening when you apply a power cutting edge to the material. You have more of an intimate feeling of what's going on the cut. So let me take this, and I've actually got, this is a piece of white oak that I'll run through, and then we'll see how we can handle that. This is a joiner, named similar to the joiner plane. But this joiner is, it's an Italian-made SCM, very nice. It's a 12-inch joiner. It's meaning the blade cutting is almost, it's actually a little less than 12 because it's in metric. I think is it 300 millimeters? Is a little less than 12. Somebody knows that, I'm sure. I never can remember that. But anyway, it has a fairly short bed, but one interesting feature of this joiner is that it's actually, it transfers into a planer. It's a combination machine. So it does the joining, then you flip up the tables, and you thickness plane. Pretty nice. I mean, it's super heavy duty, but the great aspect of that is that it takes up a lot less room in your shop. But anyway, there's lots of joiners out there. I've had the 4s, the 6s, the 8s, and I even have a 24, a big old one downstairs. So, but this will get you by plenty good, something this wide. An 8-inch joiner is really a great size if you have a smaller shop. But what they do is they, in a power way, do the planing for you, or the joining, flattening a surface. And if you think of it, it's just like a giant upside down hand plane. So if we take the joiner plane, think of it this way. Here's the joiner plane sitting here. It's got a fixed cutting edge and a flat sole. Like this is flat all the way on both sides. And you just extend the blade a little bit to make a deeper cut. Here we have these two tables and this spinning cutter head in the middle, which has 3 cutting knives right there. So it's like 3 12-inch wide or blades like that, and it spins. And these knives are always indexed in the same plane as the outfeed table or the back of the joiner. Okay, so the outfeed table is dialed in to be at the same height as those knives. And then the way you adjust the thickness of cut is you can lower the infeed table to take a heavier cut or raise it to take a lighter one. This table has an adjustment over here. There's a handle, and if I turn the handle, you can see that table going down. It drops down, and if I turn it back, that's a little too heavy. Right about there, I can lock it in. All right, so I'm going to make a few passes, and we'll flatten this other material. All right, so let's go with our pine board again. You can see the angle. So in this case, the blade is spinning this way, so I'm going to feed in this direction to be most friendly with that grain. So here we go. I'm going to use a push stick to push it through. At the end, it's got a little hook on the back. And I'll turn on the air. Nice. Now you're ready to plane it to thickness. So let me show you how this thing works pretty quick. This is going to convert to the thickness planer. You just lift up the wings like that. And then that dust port comes over. And you've got to just change the hose onto that one. And now it's a planer. Pretty quick. You just got to crank up this table. But this board is, right now, it's a little over 1 1/4. So I'm going to crank this up to 1 1/4 and just skim this off. And then let's see what we get. And then I'll see the oak board. Once I get that flat, I'll stop, and then I'll crank it up to, this is like 1 1/16. So I'll crank that to 1 inch, and we'll smooth out that plank. That always feels good to have these cleaned up, flat, true boards, and you can just plane them right down to the dimension that you need. So now they're really starting to get useful. And I would take them from here, I could edge joint and then rip them, but we're just mainly talking about surfacing today. Now, one other thing that a lot of shops are having now that wasn't available a while ago are these drum sanders. This is a 16-inch wide drum sander. It's actually got an open end, so technically you can do a 32-inch board by, similar to what we're saying on the joiner, running it through with some out hanging here and then turn it around. But if you look inside here, can you see that? It's the sandpaper drum. You tall enough? So there's the sandpaper drum. I've got like 150 on there. And when you turn that on, the table feeds and the drum spins, and you've got to have good dust collection. But the table raises up and lowers similar to a planer. But it's kind of a luxury to have in your shop. It's kind of nice. But even these, sometimes, you know, in the infeed, the pressure bobbles a little bit or midway. It's not unusual to still have machine marks with the sander where the drum like maybe bumps a little bit and you get this little bite, like a little deeper trough that's smooth so you don't see it until you're finishing your dining table top. And it shows up and you're like, oh gosh, I thought I had that all sanded. Well, that's what can happen. So if you don't have that, you still have machine marks on there from the planer. You've got those knives, the spinning head, the pressure feed rollers. They leave little marks perpendicular to the board all the way across like chatter lines. So you've got to remove those. Now you could come over here like a lot of people would maybe think, I'll just take some heavy grit 150 paper on an orbital or 100. And you could go through some coarse grits up to finer grits. You could use handheld belt sanders, which I used to do too. And, but it's amazing how fast you can do damage with a belt like that. If it slightly twists, it'll put like a dark skid. So what I've come to do, especially if I'm working with dining tabletops that are going to catch the light, any imperfection like a snipe or chatter mark like that will show up through your finish. And they're really hard to see. The only way I know to guarantee that I've removed them is by skim planing it. So we go back to the old school method. But we're not having to plane the whole thing to dimension. We're just using the planes to tune it up. And I'll show you a couple of my different planes here. This is the number 5. This is probably the one I use the most. It's got a nice length, so it's not heavy, and it will true up a length, but because it's not so long, if the board has a slight bend, it won't take forever to flatten it. So let me see if I got this. So you can see down here, I'm going to scribble right here, and you'll see that snipe. And we can even scribble the whole board. There's a snipe down the other end too, just a light one. So when you're hand planing, you hold the nose down, good pressure, so that you start smoothly. This is taking a nice light cut. I'm just going to go across one time. I'll come back here. Okay. Now see what's happened? There's a snipe here, so you see that pencil line is still there, but it's gone here. I missed that middle. So there's still a little low spot. Down here, it's very obvious. Can you see this one? So here you really see the snipe right there. The pencil line is lower so it didn't get hit, but I'm planing here. I'll just go by one more time. But what's beautiful about this is that it is shearing this surface to a beautiful polish. I tuned up this plane. I'm going to do another video on that, but I do have a video up on tuning a hand plane. But you hold your hand down again, and I'll just go all the way out. You got to clear these. Sometimes they get jammed. That's just pleasurable. I mean, look how wide those and thin they are. Just really sweet. That's the beauty of pine. If you want to learn to hand plane, pine's a good one to start with. So this, I would still check and see if I had any issues. Sometimes you get a little tear out, and you have to address that with a card scraper. And then I still will often sand. Sometimes I'll leave it right off the tool. You know, for drawer bottoms and backs of chests, I'll hand plane and just leave it like that. Let me show you this white oak. Looks like it's climbing in this direction. So now this is a hardwood, so it's got more teeth to it, but it planes pretty well. Let's see how it goes. Ooh, ooh. Actually, I gotta lower it for this. You can feel the difference in just the texture of it just from starting in. You can't take quite as much. All right, there we go. So I could scribble on this one as well, but I won't. I'll just start on the side here. That's working nice, actually. I still got a little snipe here, so it's pretty predictable. Let me show you another plane. Here's a smoothing plane. These are wider, and I usually leave these really dialed in to take a nice thin shaving, and it's made for like that last pass when you want like a perfecting, like polishing cut. So I would go to this near the end. I'd let the other planes do some of the work, but this is set lighter. I'm getting these thinner shavings and almost a polishing treatment here. See that? I mean, these are beautiful wispy shavings. I'll go the whole way here. And that is a beautiful surface. Now, I just got to see if this is working well. This has more mass, so as you push it along, you just feel the weight, and it dampens any vibration. So what's great is you can buy these new, too, from companies like Lee Nielsen, make beautiful planes. They're heavier, a little heavier than these. Here we go. That's sweet. That's oak. And then if you have little ridges, this feels pretty smooth. But you can come in and I would card scrape. And see, card scraping is like planing, except you're not shearing the material the same way as a plane does. There's a little bit of a crushing action, and the burr on the card scraper is hooking. But the beauty is you can go either direction, and you'll get shavings like that, and you don't get tear out because it's a different type of cut. But if you have little ridges or any little pits, you might have to detail. I'd hit it like that, and then go to sanding. So usually, if there's a lot to do, it's 150 to 220, and that's it. And that's a crash course in surfacing rough material. Thank you so much for being part of this. I'll see you next time.